Siblings and sisters and brothers, welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. This is a program where we every week faithfully focus on education for the people of God. Our topics include faith-filled politics, interviews of key leaders, and how-tos in congregational life, and the impacts of current realities on the life of the church will all be featured. And each webinar will include clear suggestions about what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. I am Reverend Dr. Chris Davies, and I want to introduce your host, Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, the Associate General Minister of the United Church of Christ and leader of this conversation. Welcome, Karen Georgia.
Thank you, Reverend Chris Davies. It is always a pleasure to be in this company, and particularly to get to work with Chris Davies, which happens every now and then, and I'm grateful for you. This afternoon, our conversation is actually centered in part around the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. And with me this afternoon is Miss Olive Cannings Sampson, who is from Guyana. And here in self-disclosure, I'm from Jamaica. So you're kind of having a diasporic conversation in the midst of being diaspora people. Some of us are multiple diaspora is how I self-identify at times. And so in our conversation today, we're going to be talking about how we tell our stories, particularly as they relate to issues and challenges that pertain to African descendant people in the Americas. The United Nations has declared 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. In so doing, they have identified that there are over 200 million people of African descent here in the Americas, not in the United States, but in the Americas, which includes the Caribbean, South America, North America, Central America. And those are individuals who are descendants of Africans who were brought into the region, particularly as enslaved peoples. The decade really is focused around recognition, development, and justice. And so I wanted to have some conversation, not just about where are we going with the decade, but how do we talk about the multiple narratives that inform who we are as African descendant peoples. So I'm going to come back in a couple of minutes. I want to start actually by sharing. Quite often, I will share from my own body of work. And this actually is a poem that I co-wrote with a Guyanese poet, Keon Haywood, who is a millennial. And we co-wrote this poem, which was actually called, is called Barely Breathing. As life would have it, we wanted to use it for another occasion, and it didn't get, we didn't get to use this, but what Keon did with the poem at my request was to actually recruit a number of Guyanese young people who are participating in a rendering and reading of the poem. So I want to share with you from the Guyanese context, a reading of Barely Breathing.
Crossings and musings, soul stirring, swimming sounds of drums, drowning this pain, redeeming their souls, telling our truth. Here is breathing.
I want to write history.
I have stories to tell.
Stories with no gilded edges.
With no ending planned.
Stories of shame.
Stories of death.
Stories of wrongs ignored.
Stories of life beyond the sea. Here is breathing. Memories of trees manifesting the divine. In their leaves, met with violence, axe to trunk. Transporting people, stuck as logs. there leaves another ship. Blessed by their God, cursing our soul. Who are we?
These are not fairy tales, yet they tell of once upon a time in a far-away land, full of sunshine, when royalty was black.
Kings and queens building wells without castles, loving our black skin, kissed by the sun, set gems like moonlight, leaning on the water. Here is breathing.
Walking in power, at one with the earth, reading time in the dust, hearing rain in the silence, the future carried on the wind, the voice of the mystery heard in the drums, drunk on wisdom sublime.
Here is breathing.
No surface,
No superficial.
No superficial,
No superficiality to express.
to will myself to experience you.
Black faces
black voices.
God is black,
seen in me.
created in divine image.
Black as me.
I am no orphan,
A child of these kings and queens,
sold by depraved theology, brought to a wilderness. No drums appeasing this torture. Here is breathing.
Beyond the sea, at home among the dead, named as animal.
Trotting out,
at the whim of the other,
trotting in,
to their deprived communities.
Whips,
Absent of love,
bruises,
absent of grace,
rape.
absent of this God they said was so great.
What then of me?
Stay in suffocation.
No air to breathe.
where the car go draw.
For a church built on lies, friends of all, neutral in silence, promoting the supremacy of one, praising a God white, missionaries stepping up, affirming the conditions of the enslaved, sanctioning land grabs, exploiting black lives, robbing black identity. No breath in this body.
So where the car go draw.
For a church built on empire, missing social capital, sipping sugared coffee and tea, selling pie in the sky to transported ancestors, grabbing at gold, grasping at glory, grappling with God, a corrupt cocktail of a hierarchical system, drunk on power, bloated with greed, beaten with the Bible to ensure obedience, struggling our souls. Where is life?
Beyond the sea, there is me, black skin, shining in the sun, sanity question, because I dare to question being locked up, locked in to the madness of inequity, remembering the cracks of the whip, yet defying slave drivers, standing up strong in my identity, keeping myself in the knowledge of the warriors from whom I came. Here is breathing.
Beyond the sea, resisting the will to be complicit to the diminishment of light, of breath in bodies, in a system where class, caste, color are used to concoct separate yet equal, low wages for some, mass incarceration, unemployment, poverty. If we stay in sufferation, swallowing the bile of trauma, fueled by those who thought that the skin I'm in is sin, nothing right, words strangling my life. If we not part of the change, then we part of the degradation.
Here is breathing.
Learning from it all.
I am royalty,
I am a supreme expression of the divine. I am history that did not begin or end with enslavement.
I am the wind in the trees, the voice on the breeze.
I am the wisdom of the ancestors. I am rich with melanin. I am all hues and shades of brown.
Another legacy of ancestors transported.
I am breathing.
Sister Olive,
Good afternoon.
that's a part of the
Powerful.
a part of the story, a part of our stories. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and again for sharing Barely Breathing for all of us. It's so powerful and a wonderful way to start today's conversation. I'm Olive Canning Sampson, originally from Guyana, having worked overseas in the United States for many, many years. I returned to Guyana and I am honored and humbled to have been selected to serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the International Decade for People of African Descent, Assembly Guyana. Guyana's response to the UN call for a decade to address the challenges faced by people of African descent globally. IPADA-G, as the acronym for our organization, is the country coordinating mechanism, but it is a network of civil society organizations, of culture groups, of farming co-ops, of organizations that focus on human rights as African Guyanese. But what we are in common is organizations of African descent here in Guyana. IPADA-G has a membership of 60 organizations and a board that directs the work that we do. And so that is the work that I'm doing right now. I, as I said, grew up here in Guyana, and I come from a family that has been involved in the Congregational Church from as early as 1842. My great-great-grandparents were founding members of a church in a small village here in Guyana. The church is called Freedom Congregational Church. And I know that my grandfather served as a deacon at one of those churches, Smith's Congregational Church, and was headmaster at several of the congregational schools in Guyana. So I'm particularly pleased that you've invited me because I know that among your audience today are people who are members of congregational churches, parts of those, the congregation of those churches. And so I wanted to share that little bit about me as well. Before coming to Guyana, I said I worked overseas. I worked in international relations for my entire career. So I had a career of close to 40 years in international relations. And so coming back to Guyana at this time to focus on this issue is having done a lot of volunteer work from my teens all the way throughout my career, focusing on the questions of poverty and empowerment in the African Guyanese community and in the African American community, as I was a resident of Washington, D.C. and the neighboring state of Maryland. A lot of work with the African American community. At one point, I had the distinct honor of working closely with Dr. Dorothy Height, who headed the National Council of Negro Women, and under whom the National Council created international division. And so at that time, I worked with Dr. Haidt in carrying out programs with women's organizations across the continent of Africa, in Central America and the Caribbean. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. So one of the threads here is that you have lived in multiple places and encountered the stories, the narratives, the history of African and African descendant people through your own travels and experience, and particularly as an African descendant woman. How do you tell the stories, or how do you carry this wisdom and share it as you go?
Our story, in my work and in my travels and in my just my engagement with friends and families and people who've come into my life, I think the thread that I see all across the diaspora and on the continent is the thread of exploitation, the thread of that you spoke about barely breathing. There's a sense of that we're all waiting for that moment when we can fully breathe and we can fully experience the freedom that was ours prior to the 1500s, prior to the unfortunate encounter with enslavers, with groups who would exploit the continent of Africa and its people, and later the Americas and abroad, because exploitation was not limited to the Americas. I mean, we have African descendant people who are in the Solomon Islands and all over the world. And so the thing that I think is always there is that we share in our conversations is that the desire for a true freedom to fully express and to fully be able to achieve what we know is ours to achieve in creating communities where there is safety and security of all kinds, not only in terms of physical security, but the security of knowing that we have the power within our communities to shape those communities, to be guided by our own values, and to live and love freely and with dignity. That is the shared story across the board and the shared desire. And we tap into that very quickly the minute we start to engage, regardless of where we go.
So as we talk about, I want to shift our conversation a little bit to talk about the UN International Decade. And as a Guyanese, as an activist, because you've had many years of activism, and you're still an activist, a global activist in the movements for human rights for African descendant people. So in this particular body of work that you've carried for so many years, what do you see as some of the opportunities presented to African descendant people around this UN decade?
The UN decade, I think, presents many opportunities, but it also demands that we are alert, all people. This is not limited to people of African descent. I think that because we are looking to shape a world that is fair, a world where we can all enjoy peace, where we can all enjoy the security that I just spoke about. And it takes all people to contribute to this future that we are trying to build. The opportunities are presented just in the theme of the decade: recognition, justice, and development. And so it speaks to a recognition of the challenges that we are confronted with, an honest review of our history as a people on this planet, not just the people of African descent, but people all across the world, looking at a true version of our history that represents all that it has taken to build the world in which we currently live. Some were winners, some were losers. Many of the people who were losers were not given a chance. In many ways, their lives were taken, took control of their freedom. And so we have to look at that recognition so that in the end, everyone benefits from the recognition of what has happened and a determination to correct it. That ties into the question of justice, fairness, right? Equal opportunities, reparations, addressing what has happened and ensuring that we create the level playing field through reparations, through reparative justice. And lastly, recognition, justice, and development. And there again, the question of ensuring that our communities all across the world have the opportunities for education, training, business development, and so on. So many times our businesses don't have access to credit, don't have so many things. And so those are the things that we are working on here in Guyana: recognition, justice, and development through focusing on economics, employment, education, equity, and expiation. The latter, expiation, being equality, reparations, and seeking an apology. That apology ties right back into recognition, a recognition of what happened, how did we get to where we are, and what it takes to truly achieve the goals of the decade. Recognition, justice, reparative justice, so that we repair the past, not just an empty apology, not an empty recognition, but what does it take to help people achieve an equal playing field, a level playing field, right? And part of that, we have to recognize too that we as African descendant people carry with us ancestral memory. We carry ancestral pain. What occurred for centuries is not just disappeared, it's buried very much in our souls. And we need the assistance within our own communities for healing, all across the communities for healing, and within the African descendant community as well.
Thank you. So for some of our audience, they may not be aware of the history of enslavement in Guyana, for example. One of the Olive and I had a wonderful conversation a few weeks ago, and started sharing our stories, which is how this webinar came about. And as we talked about our stories, one of the things that we talked about was the absence of a comprehensive narrative, a broader way to talk about the multiplicity of stories that are a part of the global Black communities. So we often talk about the Black community, but that's plural. It's Black communities where we're a multiplicity of people, multi-textured, different histories, but in the Americas, also a common history shaped by enslavement. So can you talk a little bit about enslavement in the Guyanese context, and also just a little bit about Guyana for those who are not as aware of the Guyanese context?
Let me just locate Guyana. Guyana sits on the northern shore of South America, We are bordered to the north by the Atlantic Ocean, to the west by Venezuela, to the east by Suriname, and to the south by Brazil. Guyana is a land of 84,000 square miles, but is very thinly populated, a population of just 775,000 people, most of whom live along the coastal plain. That is the area that was colonized first by the Dutch, then by the French, and finally by the British. Guyana gained its independence in 1966 from Britain, and here we are. But Guyana has a very, very interesting history, one that is dissimilar, I think, from most of the other nations in South America, and I'll explain why. Two reasons. One, though we shared an early history with Suriname, which is formerly Dutch Guyana, in that we were colonized by the Dutch, the Guyana finally was colonized by the British, so it's the only English-speaking country in South America. That's one thing. Secondly, we share similarities with Trinidad and, well, the rest of the former British Caribbean, the various colonies in the Caribbean, in that we have that connection through British colonialism and enslavement. But there's a huge distinction that makes Guyana unique, and that is that Guyana's population after enslavement became extremely multiracial, and that was came out of a direct decision by the British. And I'd like to tell a little bit about that story, because it is what shapes Guyana today, and what, for good or bad, is our, it creates a conundrum, a challenge in our society that we're still attempting to deal with. So to begin the story, I'd like to point out that Guyana was known as, what is now this piece of land called Guyana, was known as the Wild Coast. The name Wild Coast came about because it seemed to be untamable. The Dutch encountered this coast. It was swampy. It was filled with all kinds of, as you can imagine, this is the early 1600s, and it is tumultuous in terms of the huge rivers that pour down from the rest of South America. There are huge rivers here in Guyana. They silt up along the coast, the mangrove swamps, and the coastal plain below sea level, 6 feet below sea level. But yet the Europeans decided that this was a good place for them to, first the Dutch, trade with the indigenous people, and then to settle and to grow cocoa, coffee, cotton. And in order to do that, they have to reclaim the land from the sea, an expertise that, as you know, the Dutch brought with them, because clearly the Netherlands is a nation that was largely built and reclaimed from the sea and below sea level. So this is the first part of that story. The Dutch were the first to enslave and bring Africans to this wild coast. It is the Africans whose labor created, and they say civilized, what was the wild coast, reclaiming the land from the sea, creating a network of canals, dams, polders, and a system that drained the land and kept the sea out. That system, built starting in the 1600s, is the system on which we rely on today. The coastline along which we live would have been under the sea had it not been for the work of the enslaved Africans. That's the first thing that they did. And then were the forced unpaid labor that made the colony, there were 3 colonies, Essequibo, Berbice, and Demerara, made those 3 colonies rich for European planters. As I said before, cocoa, coffee, cotton, later sugar were the main exports. Those are the things that were planted by African descendant people. This was a very, these colonies made Europeans very wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy. And so to move on to the second part of that story, as I mentioned, the colonies went from Dutch to French to British. And we therefore had the British colony, British Guyana. Having an enslaved population, as you know, in 1807, the British abolished the transatlantic slave trade. And so no longer were Africans brought to these shores, but instead, as enslaved people, but instead they relied on the enslaved people who were here, whose children became the newly enslaved. Right? So families were broken up. Men were seen as, I guess, in today's modern parlance, sperm donors, and women just vessels to produce new slaves. So that African people were seen as producers in every way. We were farmers. We were the ones who toiled the land. We were the ones who built the machinery. We were the ones who saved the country from the sea. But we also produced the newly enslaved. So we created the wealth of this country. We did everything. Our ancestors did everything that made the Europeans who held the plantations here wealthy. And as these Africans toiled and revolted as they did on more than one occasion, the most significant revolt of the 18th century was the 1763 rebellion. It's called the Berbice Slave Rebellion. Little is known of our history. And here's the thing, Sister Karen, Georgia, do you know, our history is told by the hunter, and they say the lion's story will never be told until he tells it himself. Until such time, it is the story of the hunter. We know that, we all know about 1776 and the glory of the US independence, but we don't know that in 1763, in the colony of Berbice, enslaved Africans revolted successfully and created the first republic in the Western Hemisphere. The first republic in the Western Hemisphere was created in Berbice, a colony of the Dutch, and was declared by Africans. Right? It's lasted for a year. The Dutch were unable to defeat them and called upon the British and all other Europeans to come and to help them to put down this rebellion, which they did. Subsequently, you have Haiti, and that successful rebellion left the establishment of the free Haitian nation of Haiti. But so in 1763 was the first rebellion. 1823 was another rebellion, the Demerara Revolt. And so over 200 people beheaded. And so by the time you come to 1833, the declaration, the passage of the British law that ended enslavement in 1834, the actual enactment of it, Africans have been waiting. They have fought successfully on more than one occasion to gain their freedom. They know the land because they're the ones toiling it. They're in the majority in the space that they have created. I want to go back to that. They, from the 1600s, saved this land from the sea. They knew the technology to protect it from the sea. They knew how to make the land produce. They were the producers of all that this land produced. They were the builders. They were the welders. They were the majority in this land. And so they were looking forward in 1834 to freedom and to finally claiming the land that they had built. But instead, the British passed another law that required that they remain apprentices. They were apprenticed on jobs that they had been doing for their entire lives. It was this very cynical and sad decision by the British. But Africans remained on the plantation as apprentices. But there was one good thing that happened there, and that is that they were allowed in their spare time, which was limited, to go to work for other planters. And they could sell their experience, they could sell their expertise. So welders could go and work in another plantation that was short-staffed, and they earned money. And the amazing thing that happened, when the apprenticeship period ended, they had already been thinking about exactly what they would do on this final day where they know that they're finally going to be free and that this nation that they built would be theirs. They had pooled their money and looked around and bought the abandoned plantations, because British planters started to abandon the plantations once they realized that they didn't have the labor to maintain those plantations. Right? So they started to abandon them. Africans bought them. It was the largest land purchase of any ever seen in this entire hemisphere. In today's dollars, it'd be billions of dollars of land that was purchased by formerly enslaved. And the British saw that and decided that that the Africans were amassing too much wealth and that they would find ways to prevent that from happening. And so laws were passed so that no longer could the 83 or so people who had come together to make those land purchases, no longer could they do that. All of a sudden, here's a law that says no more than 10 people. And so that came to an end. That's the first disappointment. The second disappointment is that the British then decided that they would import indentured laborers. And this is where the difficulty came. They first imported laborers from China, from Portugal, and these people came but quickly left the plantation. They, as indentured laborers, had those choices that they could make. They were on a contract for a short period of time. The final group was brought from India, from one of the poorest parts of India, people who were indeed already, had suffered and were looking forward to coming to a place where they could experience greater prosperity. And while there were 80,000 African descendants in Guyana at the time at the end of enslavement, at the end of the apprenticeship period, the British imported double that number of East Indian indentured laborers. And so they made African Guyanese a minority in the nation that they had built. And that is at the crux of our today's challenge for African Guyanese, because not only did they bring in a number that made us the minority, but at the same time, they provided to those East Indian and other indentured laborers land and opportunities that were never provided and still have not been to people of African descent. They were given land for free. They were given land that was developed. They were given houses. They were given business opportunities like the rice farming and the opportunities to export. The Portuguese were made to be commission agents. Africans were prohibited. And so we can go on. I just wanted to point out the uniqueness of our situation, because in Guyana, one, we have the village movement where we bought plantations and developed villages, which led to the nation that we have today. That's the cornerstone of Guyana, the village movement, which is based on the purchase of plantations, the creation of villages on those plantations, villages designed by Africans and created by Africans. That was our step towards creating a nation that would have been that of the African Guyanese. That opportunity was taken away, still has been taken away. And instead, we face a nation that is multiracial, but built on the suppression and oppression of people of African descent. It's a long story, Sister Karen, but I just wanted to lay that out. That is where we sit today as we deal with the decade.
Thank you so much, and I hope that for those who are listening, that that history is helpful, because there's so many parallels with the history of African Americans, with the history of when you talk about the Caribbean, that this idea of the ways in which African descendant people were denied access is something that is important to hear, because that intentionality has created the system that we currently see. So when we talk about, well, you know, people should be able to help themselves, or they should be able to create some different kind of narrative for themselves, we have to look at that history where others were brought in and were given access, whether it is to land or to resources, which of course is a part of the issue also here in the United States when you think about the homesteading, the push west, the displacement of indigenous people, and the land access that were given to settlers who came from Europe. So thank you so much for laying that out so plainly and clearly, because it points to why there's the need for development, for recognition, and for justice in this moment of talking about the decade. Thank you so much for that. So we have, the time goes by so quickly. We have about 10 minutes. So in the 10 minutes, I want to turn attention a little bit, because our community here primarily is church. And I want to turn a little bit to talking about one, the history of the church, both in terms of the enslavement of people, the church as a part of the history of liberation, you know, of African descendant people, liberation narratives, but also in this present moment, for you, what would be the call that you would say to the church around understanding the history? And I know this is a big question, but you know, what would you say to the church in Guyana, the church global, you know, and the church named as coming out of that history of colonialism, but also now the church in terms of the Black church experience that's here as well. So you could jump in on that.
Yeah. You know, for some people, there is a painful truth that we have to admit to about the church. There's good, but there's also a deep flaw in the relationship, a deep hurt that exists between the church and African descendant people. Let us start, as I should say, that even though my ancestors were Congregationalists, I was baptized Congregationalist, became Catholic at a very young age. So I have had a relationship with Catholic Church. Therefore, I feel very comfortable in saying that the Catholic Church was the first to dishonor and to create what I would say is the original sin of ignoring and condoning enslavement, and also the destruction of indigenous people in its papal bull that divided the Western Hemisphere between Portugal and Spain, and allowed in that declaration for the Christianization of indigenous people and all others who they considered to be, they don't use the word heathen, and I can't remember the word, but it's certainly not, let us use the word heathen for the moment. because they spoke to the lack of a soul of these people, that people who did not look like Europeans, therefore were soulless, could be exploited. The Catholic Church at that time certainly was in power across Europe. Its word meant something. This is in the mid 1400s. I don't want to give a date because I know I'll be wrong. The Treaty of Tordesillas comes out of that and speaks to the church's approval of the dehumanization of people. Right? Protestant religions coming after that did not in any way take a position against the position the Catholic Church took. That's the beginning of that story. But following that, the church was used, church missionaries were used, I would say, as the Trojan horse in a war that moved people away from their own cultures, their own religions, and their own pride in self and who we are, and understanding that what we represent as people, our indigenous way of relating to God, our indigenous ways of being in community have value. Those things were taken away, and they were taken away through doctrines of the church. You could only be accepted if you belonged to a particular church. Hence my baptism as a Catholic, so that I could go to Catholic schools, which were considered better schools. So all along, the church has played a damaging role in the whole process of colonization and re-engineering of cultures. And so the church has to take responsibility for that. At the same time, as I mentioned in introducing myself, my grandparents and many members of my family, in terms of my ancestors, were teachers in these very religious schools that were run by the Congregational Church, the Catholic Church. And so they did play a role in education, but that education always left us as African descendants, the sense that we were aspiring to be like someone else. That for us to be the best we can be, we must be Europeanized. Our thinking must move away from Africa and our natural inherent culture, sense of self, sense of dignity. I actually had the experience. The Catholic schools I went to, the school was taught by Irish nuns. And one of them actually made it very clear to me that, and I won't quote her because I don't wish to, but it was very painful I think I was about 7 or 8, that she made it very clear that as an African child, she didn't use that. It was, you have to learn, we are here to teach you to break some of the habits that you have, to be more like us, essentially. And it had to do with clothing and with another child, actually, and her comment about that child. And so they understood the role of a missionary. It was to reshape people, and to also keep a certain group of people in their place. So what should the church do about it? First, the church must admit. The church must admit how it came to be in our midst. What was its initial purpose? And to go back to, I think the church has to now honor that African past. The church has to recognize that in the case of that, the church itself grew out of some ancient African traditions. The church has to admit that there are aspects of ancient Egyptian history that, if you look at it, predated the Christian church, and in fact are the original stories that are now told as those of Christianity. The church has to speak about the role of missionaries and how missionaries sought to partnered with the colonizers to control. Having admitted that, the church ought to be a part of a reparative justice movement. The church has to, if the church is to maintain its credibility.
Wow. Thank you for that. And I think that there are certainly the reparations conversations that are starting, well, not starting, that are continuing. I think that there are churches that are becoming a part of those conversations. But I think that what you said that was so important is that place of acknowledgement and apology, and that needs to be a place of authentic apology. The second is, when you talked about honoring that African past, right? That there was so much that was taken from African peoples and their descendants, the disqualification of our humanity, the disqualification of traditions, the ways that people owned, knew, and understood God present, the divine, maybe called by a different name. So I just want to thank you for being present, and thank you for that charge to the church, um, because that is incredible, and is very much necessary. I want to close out with a final question, and maybe this may have a short answer. I don't know. Um, but what was the year of the Buxton Railroad Revolt? Do you?
I saw that pop up.
Yes.
The Buxton, this is a story that I'll try to make it very fast. After the Africans purchased the plantations, as I said, they created villages. Those villages became thriving economic units, and the British sought to destroy them because, to the degree that Africans could be self-sufficient, they would not work on the plantations. So they taxed them heavily, and they did not support their drainage and irrigation systems. They made them have to pay for everything and tax. Talk about regressive taxation. I guess that's where it began. And so Buxton, people of Buxton, one of the first villages that was built off of this purchased plantation, they took it upon themselves they wanted to speak to the governor. The governor was ignoring them, but they knew that the governor had gone to Berbice or somewhere, was coming back on the train. And so they got on the train line, and I believe this is somewhere in the 1860s, and I'll have to check that date. It was in the 1860s, and they got on the train line. They say it's the women, I don't know, and they just refused to move. And so the train had to stop, and the governor had to listen to them. So in Guyana, that village of Buxton is still a very powerful village, and it is always said, when we speak of how powerful Buxton is, we say, well, Buxton people stop train. So.
All right. Buxton people stop train. Olive, thank you so much for being here with us. We have to get you back. The stories are important. All these stories, the way that they connect, the movement, the ongoing movement for justice is one that unites us all in a variety of ways. And being able to tell the story as a Jamaican, being able to tell the story of African Americans, being able to tell the story of Guyanese people, or of what happened in Barbados or any of these places, is also a part of my story, because our stories are all intertwined, both in the oppression and also in the redemption, and the hope that we carry as people. And so we continue to journey through these places. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Chris Davies, to take us out of here. And thank you all for being present.
To take us out, but to call us into the action of continuing to show up alongside those who are most and multiply oppressed in service to the liberation Christ calls us into. I want to let you know, for those of you who are listening, that on Thursday of this week, we have a program called #StopTheHate, and we will be witnessing to, worshiping with, and showing up alongside and for many folk as people of Asian American descent or Pacific Islander descent in response to the attacks on the elderly and that which is occurring in this country now. On next week, we are going to look on Tuesday and Thursday into what's happening at General Synod. So if you are excited to see just a glimpse of some of the stories that are getting ready and getting rooted behind the worship of General Synod, some of those organizers will be with us. And as always, if this conversation has moved you, and if these stories have illuminated action within you or called you to do more of the work that is our collective work of justice, please consider donating into the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444 to help us to continue to host programs like this and to work together towards a just world for all people. To close us out, Reverend Karen Georgia Thompson, would you be willing to close us in a short prayer?
Absolutely. Holy God, known by many names, we are grateful for this moment, thankful that the stories that call us, unite us, are very much a part of the call for justice. And so we will keep telling our stories, we will keep singing our songs. And most of all, oh God, we thank you that you are God who is beyond being one tradition or being known to one people. And so we thank you too for the opportunities to learn more about you through the stories that we carry about how we have encountered you in the various places where we have been. So we close out by saying thank you, thank you, thank you. Ashe, ashe, asheo. Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.